Thank you for listening. This course was created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional podcasts, books, newsletters, and cool merchandise await. Let's get started. Generative artificial intelligence introduces complex challenges around intellectual property, particularly in the realms of copyright and licensing. Unlike earlier forms of software, these systems are not limited to processing data, but actively generate new content, text, images, music, and more that may resemble or even directly reference existing works. This blurring of boundaries raises questions about ownership of both training materials and outputs. Some argue that generative AI represents transformative innovation, while others see it as a form of unauthorized reproduction. Courts and regulators are paying increasing attention as disputes grow over whether AI systems are infringing on rights or enabling new forms of creativity. This tension between protection and innovation sets the stage for ongoing debate, one that is reshaping intellectual property frameworks worldwide. The use of copyrighted works in training datasets is one of the most contentious aspects of generative AI. Many systems are trained on large-scale internet corpora that inevitably include protected material, from books and articles to images and music. The central legal debate revolves around whether this constitutes fair use, especially in the United States, or infringement, as argued by rights holders. Proponents of fair use emphasize the transformative purpose of AI training, which creates new capabilities rather than replicating originals. Opponents highlight that creators rarely consent to such use and receive no compensation. Globally, there is no consensus. While some jurisdictions lean toward permissiveness, others are moving to restrict unlicensed use. The lack of clarity increases the risk of litigation, making data sourcing one of the most pressing legal and ethical questions for AI developers. Licensing training data offers a pathway to reduce these risks, though it brings its own challenges. Organizations may obtain licensed datasets directly from rights holders or rely on curated collections with clear permissions. Open data sources, such as public domain works or openly licensed materials, provide safer alternatives but often lack the scale needed for large models. Proprietary licensing agreements add further complexity, with restrictions on how data can be used or shared. Transparency in sourcing becomes essential, as organizations must be able to demonstrate that training inputs were collected and used responsibly. Licensing not only mitigates legal risk, but also signals respect for creators, aligning with ethical expectations of fairness and accountability. Ownership of outputs generated by AI is another unresolved issue with significant implications. Some jurisdictions maintain that copyright requires human authorship, meaning purely AI-generated works are not protected. Others recognize hybrid scenarios, where human involvement in prompting or curation may establish authorship. The debate extends to industries such as publishing, design, and music, where creators worry that AI outputs may compete with or devalue human work. Without clear recognition of ownership, businesses face uncertainty about whether they can commercialize AI-generated content securely. This lack of clarity complicates contracts, licensing deals, and user agreements, underscoring the need for coherent legal frameworks that balance human contribution with machine assistance. Users of generative AI tools also encounter questions about rights and obligations. Platforms often define terms of service that shape what individuals can do with outputs, particularly in commercial contexts. Some agreements grant users full rights, while others impose restrictions or require attribution. Users must also respect the licensing of the underlying system, as violations can expose them to liability. These obligations highlight that responsibility extends beyond developers to those who deploy AI tools in practice. Whether creating art, software code, or business content, users must navigate a complex web of rights and restrictions, often shaped more by contractual terms than by settled law. Derivative works add another layer of complexity, especially when outputs closely resemble original copyrighted material. If a generated image or passage of text is substantially similar to a protected work, it may be considered infringement. The difficulty lies in defining what constitutes substantial similarity in the context of machine generation, where outputs may echo patterns without directly copying. This raises challenges for disclosure, as organizations may need to inform users about the risk of inadvertent resemblance. Clear policies and disclaimers help manage expectations, but disputes will likely continue until courts or regulators establish firmer guidance. Derivative work considerations remind us that generative AI operates in a gray zone where creativity and copyright frequently collide. Moral rights introduce further complexity into the conversation about generative AI and intellectual property. In many jurisdictions outside the United States, creators maintain rights that go beyond economic control, including the right to attribution and the right to object to derogatory or distorted uses of their work. Generative systems complicate these rights by producing outputs that may reference, mimic, or transform original works without acknowledgement. For instance, an AI might generate art in the style of a particular artist without crediting them, potentially infringing on attribution rights. Integrity rights also come into play when outputs distort or misrepresent the intent of the original creator. International differences in how moral rights are recognized amplify these challenges, creating potential conflicts when generative AI is deployed globally. Open-source licensing is another critical area of debate, as the generative AI ecosystem increasingly depends on shared resources. Open models and datasets provide opportunities for innovation and collaboration, but they come with license terms that must be respected. Some open licenses permit broad reuse, while others impose conditions such as attribution, share-alike provisions, or restrictions on commercial use. Conflicts arise when open-source components are integrated into proprietary systems without compliance, leading to disputes within the community. At the same time, open-source initiatives offer a counterbalance to proprietary ecosystems, democratizing access to powerful tools. The growth of open-source models highlights the importance of license compliance not only as a legal obligation, but also as a matter of community trust and cooperation. Commercial licensing models shape how generative AI is adopted at scale, particularly in enterprise environments. Subscription-based access is common, giving users entry to tools while centralizing control in the hands of providers. Enterprises often negotiate broader licenses, securing rights for large-scale internal use or integration into products. Data providers may also establish agreements that allow their materials to be used in training under specific conditions, balancing access with protection. Custom contracts help organizations manage risk, defining obligations for compliance, attribution, or indemnification. These commercial arrangements demonstrate that licensing is not just about legality, but about creating sustainable ecosystems where innovation and protection coexist. Businesses that proactively negotiate licensing terms position themselves to adopt generative AI responsibly and securely. Compliance obligations ensure that copyright and licensing practices are not just theoretical but operationalized. Documenting the data sources used in training models provides transparency, enabling organizations to demonstrate due diligence in sourcing. Disclosing licensing terms to users helps clarify rights and responsibilities, reducing ambiguity about what outputs can be used for. Maintaining audit trails allows organizations to track how licensing decisions were made and to show regulators or courts that proper processes were followed. Aligning with global frameworks ensures that compliance is recognized across jurisdictions, reducing the risk of cross-border disputes. These obligations require infrastructure and governance, embedding copyright and licensing into organizational practice rather than leaving them as abstract concerns. Ethical dimensions cut across every aspect of copyright and licensing in generative AI. Respect for creative labor underscores the need to acknowledge and compensate creators whose works are used in training. Avoiding exploitation means resisting the temptation to treat creative communities as free resources for technological advancement. Equity in access raises questions about who benefits from generative AI. Will it reinforce existing inequalities, or can licensing models create broader opportunities? Balancing openness with fairness requires careful design of policies that encourage innovation while protecting vulnerable creators. Ethical reflection ensures that copyright and licensing are not reduced to box-ticking exercises, but are recognized as central to the fairness and legitimacy of AI systems. Regulatory developments are rapidly evolving in response to these intellectual property challenges. Courts are beginning to shape case law that interprets how copyright applies to training and outputs, though rulings vary across jurisdictions. Legislative proposals are under debate in many regions, with some suggesting explicit requirements for licensing training data. International coordination is also gaining momentum, as cross-border use of generative systems demands harmonization to prevent conflicting obligations. Industry standards are anticipated to provide clearer guidance, defining norms for provenance, disclosure, and licensing practices. These developments will not eliminate disputes, but they will gradually establish firmer rules of the road, helping both developers and users navigate the complex intersection of generative AI and copyright law. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Risk management approaches help organizations navigate the uncertainties of copyright and licensing in generative AI. Conducting intellectual property risk assessments allows teams to identify where exposure is greatest, such as unverified datasets or unclear platform terms. Building safe sourcing strategies, such as relying on licensed or public domain materials, reduces the chance of disputes. Internal guidelines can further clarify acceptable practices, providing employees with clear boundaries for data use and output handling. Training teams on obligations ensures that compliance is not just a policy on paper, but a practice embedded into daily workflows. Risk management transforms copyright from a vague threat into a structured part of governance, giving organizations tools to innovate while minimizing legal and reputational harm. Transparency practices are central to building trust in how generative AI systems are trained and deployed. Disclosing the datasets used for training helps users and regulators understand what sources shaped a model's capabilities. Publishing licensing information demonstrates compliance and respect for intellectual property, strengthening the credibility of developers and providers. Informing users of their rights and limitations clarifies how outputs may be used, reducing confusion and potential misuse. Transparency also enhances accountability, as openness about sourcing and licensing signals that organizations are willing to be scrutinized. By embracing transparency, companies turn potential suspicion into confidence, reinforcing their commitment to responsible AI. Tools supporting compliance are emerging to help organizations manage the complexity of licensing obligations. Dataset auditing platforms can scan training corpora for copyrighted content, flagging risks for review. License management software helps track agreements, ensuring that terms are not violated as datasets or outputs are reused. Provenance tracking systems embedded in AI pipelines can record the origins of data and provide documentation to stakeholders. Integrating compliance tools with governance frameworks ensures that copyright management is not siloed, but connected to broader accountability structures. These tools reduce the burden on human teams, making compliance more scalable and systematic, while also creating verifiable evidence for audits and disputes. Cross-border implications highlight the global nature of copyright challenges. Copyright laws vary significantly across jurisdictions, creating uncertainty for systems deployed internationally. A dataset considered fair use in one country may be infringing in another, leading to conflicts in enforcement. Organizations must adapt by localizing compliance strategies, aligning practices with the specific requirements of each jurisdiction where they operate. At the same time, calls for international harmonization are growing, recognizing that fragmented rules create inefficiencies and confusion. Until such harmonization is achieved, companies must be prepared to navigate a patchwork of obligations, tailoring their governance to multiple legal regimes. Cross-border complexity makes copyright in generative AI one of the most challenging areas of global regulation. Industry self-regulation is emerging as a complement to formal legal frameworks. Voluntary commitments, such as pledges to respect intellectual property and compensate creators, are becoming more common among AI providers. Collective licensing frameworks, where groups of rights holders and AI developers negotiate shared agreements, offer a way to reduce friction and disputes. Industry associations are also promoting best practices, encouraging consistent approaches that build trust across the ecosystem. Collaboration with rights holders ensures that policies are not imposed unilaterally but developed in dialogue. While self-regulation cannot replace law, it can help set higher standards and create models that legislators may later adopt or formalize. Future directions in copyright and licensing point toward gradual convergence and innovation. Global clarification of authorship rules is anticipated, as courts and lawmakers grapple with whether AI-generated works can be copyrighted. Licensing marketplaces are likely to emerge, offering standardized ways to purchase or access training data legally. Provenance standards will become more robust, making it easier to trace and verify the sources behind outputs. Regulatory frameworks across jurisdictions may begin to align, reducing cross-border conflicts and providing clearer global norms. These trends suggest that while copyright challenges will not disappear, they will become more manageable, supported by clearer rules, better tools, and cooperative industry practices. Organizational responsibilities in copyright and licensing extend across governance, operations, and culture. Internal intellectual property policies must be established, clearly outlining how training data is sourced, how outputs may be used, and what compliance processes are required. Staff should be trained not only in the technical aspects of licensing, but also in the ethical principles underpinning respect for creative labor. Documentation and compliance checks should be routine, with audit trails ensuring that sourcing and licensing decisions can be verified. Leadership must align practices with evolving regulation, dedicating resources and oversight to maintain compliance even as laws shift. By treating copyright and licensing as shared responsibilities, organizations strengthen their credibility and reduce the risk of disputes or sanctions. Practical takeaways highlight how generative AI introduces new challenges for copyright, but also how governance can mitigate them. Both training data and outputs raise questions of ownership, requiring developers and users alike to exercise caution. Transparency in data sourcing, licensing disclosures, and terms of use reduces risk while building trust. Licensing models, from open source to enterprise agreements, offer structured ways to balance innovation with protection. Ultimately, organizations that integrate copyright management into their governance frameworks demonstrate responsibility, safeguard their reputation, and enable sustainable adoption of generative AI. These takeaways show that intellectual property is not just a legal hurdle but a cornerstone of responsible deployment. The forward outlook suggests that copyright and licensing will remain contested but increasingly structured. More litigation is expected in the short term, as courts clarify how laws apply to training data and outputs. Over time, regulatory frameworks will solidify, providing clearer expectations for compliance. Provenance tracking will see wider adoption, helping organizations verify and disclose the origins of training materials. Industry self-regulation will expand, complementing formal laws with voluntary commitments and collective frameworks. As these trends converge, copyright in generative AI will shift from uncertainty to structured governance, with clearer paths for innovation that respect both creators and users. A summary of key points consolidates this episode's themes. Copyright applies to both the inputs used to train AI and the outputs those systems generate, raising disputes over ownership and infringement. Licensing provides structured solutions, from open data agreements to negotiated contracts, ensuring responsible use of creative works. Compliance requires documentation, transparency, and alignment with governance frameworks. Ethical respect for creators must remain central, preventing exploitation and reinforcing fairness. These points together illustrate that copyright and generative AI is not only a technical or legal issue, but a question of responsibility and trust. In conclusion, copyright and licensing in generative AI, I highlight the need to balance innovation with protection, creativity with fairness. Organizations must navigate complex legal landscapes while upholding ethical obligations to respect creators and their work. Governance strategies, licensing models, and transparency practices provide the tools for compliance and trust, ensuring that AI systems are both effective and responsible. As regulatory and industry frameworks mature, these practices will become standardized, making copyright management a routine part of AI development. Looking ahead, the discussion will turn to provenance and watermarking, exploring how technical methods can support traceability, authenticity, and accountability in generative AI systems. Thanks for tuning in to Bare Metal Cyber, your trusted source for cybersecurity educational materials, news, and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.